What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. Wanted to try something a little different today by looking at the all-time top 10 domestic box office performers when adjusted for inflation. And I know people are sick to death of hearing the word inflation these days, but it's just a way of being able to compare movies from a long time ago to today in terms of just pure raw ticket sales. And in the end, that's what the movie business is all about, putting butts in seats. I mean, Top Gun Maverick, that movie's been putting butts in seats all summer. It's just been an absolute runaway success, and it is now officially in the top 10 when you're unadjusted for inflation. But the top 10 changes quite a bit when you do adjust, and I think it's just fascinating looking at the way tastes have changed over the years when it comes to musicals or sci-fi or historical epics or horror or whatever the case might be. But just to be clear, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on domestic box office. I'm not a statistician or a mathematician, but according to the people who keep track of all these things, it's much more difficult to measure international box office when adjusted for inflation because of the different ways that different nations do their own measurements for that. And so basically, I'm drawing upon a couple different resources for this. The primary one is Box Office Mojo, but also luckily there are a ton of articles written a couple years ago after Avengers Endgame made just all the money in the world. People wanted to compare and contrast the official top 10 versus the adjusted top 10. And so I did a lot of comparing and contrasting between all the various articles that were written, and I found very, very few discrepancies. The top 10 remained the same no matter where I looked. There's one movie, the number 3, where the total tickets sold, there's some slight discrepancy, but I'll get to that in a little bit. So once again, this is not an exact science. It's a little bit of a moving target because sometimes movies will be released in different formats, which will allow different ticket prices, like 3D versus IMAX versus standard or whatever the case might be. And obviously, a lot of these movies have been released several times across multiple decades. And I'm just going to rely upon the expertise of people who are much smarter than I am, and I'm just going to regurgitate the information that I have found, along with a little color commentary about what I think about each of these individual movies. But I should say from the outset, I'm old enough where I saw 3 of these movies in the theater during their initial theatrical runs. But let's go ahead and get started with the number 10, a movie that I did not see upon its initial theatrical release, but Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 1937. And it's got an estimated 109 million tickets sold here in the U.S., which according to Box Office Mojo translates to roughly over $1 billion in domestic box office when adjusted for inflation. And I get it. It was Disney's first animated feature film. The songs are great. The animation and the rotoscoping is incredibly fluid and beautiful. And think about like a 1937 audience seeing most of your movies in black and white. Imagine seeing all that color just bursting on the screen. But what I love most about this movie is how back in the day, Disney was willing to scare the shit out of little kids with some brilliant sequences that feel ripped straight from a horror movie. And so, yeah, it truly is a film from a bygone era, but I think it beats the pants off most of the animated movies released today. But speaking of horror, let's go right into our number 9, a movie which for much of my childhood was my all-time favorite movie. And we are, of course, talking about William Friedkin's 1973 adaptation of William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, a legit horror masterpiece with over 110 million tickets sold. It just barely edges out Snow White with an adjusted lifetime gross $1,036,314,504. And most of these tickets were sold during its initial release when it just steamrolled over the public like a total juggernaut, just traumatizing the shit out of people. And for my personal taste and for my money, I think the theatrical cut of this movie is vastly superior to the re-released version you've never seen, which was an attempt to basically make the author happy with a version that is a little closer in terms of structure to his novel. But the 70s was renowned for their really kick-ass bleak endings, and the original cut of the film has a far superior it's just like a fucking ice pick right into the middle of your forehead, and then the music kicks in, and it's just great. And the way the ending was softened in subsequent versions just kills me. So make sure you're always watching the original theatrical cut when you're watching this movie. And just to give you an idea of how much I love this movie and still love this movie, for your viewing pleasure, here I am visiting the stairs back in the fall of 2021. But I love how there's at least one legit horror classic on this top 10 list. But moving on, for number 8, we have a movie that I wish was David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia, because I think it's a way better movie. But instead, we have David Lean's next feature film, Dr. Zhivago from 1965, based on the 1957 novel by Boris Pasternak, if I'm saying that correctly. I had the opportunity to see this film fully restored at the El Capitan Theater at Hollywood Boulevard. And while those were the best conditions imaginable for watching the movie, I've also seen Lawrence of Arabia in 70mm twice, as well as just in regular 35mm a third time, and I think that blows this movie out of the water. In any event, with 124 million tickets sold, Dr. Zhivago has an adjusted lifetime gross of $1,163,149,635, which is not bad for a love story set against the backdrop of World War I and Russia's October Revolution. And it's just incredible how much tastes have changed in the last 60 years, where this could be just a runaway box office sensation. But Omar Sharif and Julie Christie, they're in fine form, as is Rod Steiger in one of his most ruthless performances. So while my preferred films by David Lean might be movies like Bridge on the River Kwai, Brief Encounter, and of course Lawrence of Arabia, which is my favorite historical epic ever, nonetheless, I'm thrilled that at least one of David Lean's films made this list. But this next movie, our number 7, should come as no surprise to anyone, in that it's one of the key movies credited with ushering in the 70s era of blockbuster filmmaking. And we're talking about Jaws from 1975. And this is yet another hit based upon a best-selling book. It's incredible just how many of these top 10 movies are based on bestsellers. It's always a good idea to have a little pre-existing audience, so whether you're talking about The Exorcist or Dr. Zhivago or Jaws. But with 128 million tickets sold, it enjoys a nice fat adjusted domestic gross of $1.2 billion. Spielberg is the only director who has 2 movies on this list, which is why he is Steven fucking Spielberg. But Jaws, it just rocks. It still rocks. And I think that Robert Shaw's monologue about the USS Indianapolis, it remains one of the great moments in cinema. It's just absolutely gripping, and there's not a special effect or a shark in sight. But I think Rob Zombie said it best when he was offering commentary on this movie on some Talking Heads video I saw years ago, where he said after he first saw it, he was in the Midwest at a Denny's in the bathroom, and he was still absolutely petrified that any second he was going to be eaten by a shark. So I think that says it all. The movie has undeniable power. But let's move on to our next movie, our number 6, which once again shows just how much mainstream tastes have changed. But we have this sweeping religious epic, The Ten Commandments, actually the remake of The Ten Commandments, but it stars Charlton Heston, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. And it has 131 million tickets sold with an adjusted domestic gross of $1,227,470,000, just barely edging out Jaws. And people forget how back in the 50s, historical epics and religious epics, they were like the Marvel of that time, whether you're talking about like El Cid or Ben-Hur or whatever the case might be. In these movies, they had 3 to 4 hour running times. They had these casts of thousands. They had these massive movie stars. And director Cecil B. DeMille, he just excelled at these movies from the 1920s up through the 1950s. And it took me years to understand the joke from Blazing Saddles about how when Gene Wilder boasted he must have killed more people than Cecil B. DeMille, but Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, they're both on fire on this movie. And it's not necessarily my kind of flick. However, it's totally worth watching in its entirety just to make the rainy golf sequence in Caddyshack hit with that much more punch, because it uses the music and the biblical power from the Ten Commandments. But let's get into our top 5. And let's start with one that if you were to look at international top 10, it would rank even higher. But for U.S. all-time domestic adjusted box office, we have James Cameron's Titanic from 1997. Now, when it comes to conversations about box office, whether you're talking about domestic or international or adjusted or unadjusted, James Cameron's name is always going to be in the mix. And just by comparison, if you look at the all-time adjusted box office, Avatar ranks number 15, but Titanic has sold 135 million tickets here in the U.S., which gives it an adjusted lifetime gross of $1,270,101,626. And my sister saw it 13 times in the theater, which is why it has sold so many tickets. I mean, for my personal taste, give me Terminator, give me Aliens, give me The Abyss, give me T2, or give me True Lies. I prefer them all to Titanic, but this movie just really struck a chord with audiences, and so while it is not my cup of tea, I get why it is ranked so high. But with number 4, we have a movie that I'm a little bit more sentimental about because I saw it with my grandmother during its initial theatrical run. We have Steven Spielberg's E.T., which sold 141 million tickets, most of which were during its initial run, which gives it a lifetime adjusted domestic total of 1,329,174,791. And it just floored me at age 6 when I saw this sucker. I was the ideal target audience for this experience, and I just absolutely ate it up. Now, as a mean old bastard, my taste much more is in line with Raiders of the Lost Ark or Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. But this movie, it changed Reese's Pieces' fortunes forever. The music still gets to me. And once again, this is why Steven Spielberg is Steven fucking Spielberg, because he's got 2 movies in this top 10 list, which is just absolutely insane. But for number 3, we have a movie where I have no sentimental or nostalgic love or affection. It's actually a source of great childhood trauma because it's my mother's favorite movie, The Sound of Music from 1965, directed by Robert Wise. I did not see it until I was over 40 years old because when I was in kindergarten, I went to an all-guys school, and we would always put on plays and musicals, and so all the guys had to play girls, and at age 6 in 1982, I think, or 83, I was not down with dressing in a dress with makeup and a little bow in my hair and all that kind of stuff, and what made it even worse is that my mother and my teacher and all of our friends kept saying, "Oh, but you look so pretty." And I was like, just the embarrassment. I was turning 10 shades of crimson. All my friends were pointing and laughing. It was horrible. And so I knew the songs to this musical very, very well, but I avoided it deliberately for a very, very long time. But if Julie Andrews is your thing, obviously this is going to be one of your favorite movies. And this is the one movie on the list where I found some discrepancies on total tickets sold, because Box Office Mojo claims that it sold 142 million tickets. But all the articles that I read around the time of Avengers Endgame, they all claim that this movie sold 157 million domestically, but they all agree that it's the number 3 movie, with anywhere from what's listed on Box Office Mojo, 1,335,000,000, up to 1.41 billion, depending upon which source you want to go with. In any event, it is number 3 wherever you look. It's a giant runaway sensation. Like I said, it's my mother's favorite movie, but I doubt I will ever watch it ever again. But number 2, it's a no-brainer. It's easily the most popular American movie of the last 50 years. Countless filmmakers have credited this movie with launching their own careers, and it's Star Wars. And for all of you out there, all you youngins who like to call it A New Hope, that's not the name of the fucking movie. For decades, this movie was referred to as Star Wars, and there was no confusion because the next movie was The Empire Strikes Back, and the next movie was The Return of the Jedi. And it wasn't until the 21st century that all these little millennials started calling it A New Hope. Say, oh, it avoids confusion. You got to know like what chapter it is. No, you don't. If you call a movie Star Wars, they know which movie you are talking about. Plus, most of the other movies since those original 3 have kind of been lame. I mean, we get the occasional moments where it feels like Star Wars, but at any rate, I digress. But I was taken to see this movie as a baby. I screamed like hell, but I was one of those 178 million tickets sold, leading to a lifetime adjusted domestic gross of $1,668,979,715. That's a lot of do-re-mi, but it deserves it. I mean, what can you say about Star Wars that hasn't already been said? But the characters, the music, the pastiche of influences, the conceptual designs going into it. It's just the ultimate crowd pleaser, and it changed science fiction and fantasy forever. And no matter what I might feel about the various shows and some of the movies that have come out since then, the 1977 Star Wars, it fucking rocks no matter how many times you've seen it. But let's finally get to the number 1 domestic box office performer of all time with an estimated 202 million tickets sold from 1939. We have Gone with the Wind. Now, my mother claims to have read this entire novel while breastfeeding me back in 1976. And so this is one of those movies that got a lot of playtime in my household on VHS as a kid. And almost always I would run screaming out of the room to read comics or play Nintendo. And the idea of watching Gone with the Wind as a kid was pure hell to me. And I would come back like days later and like somehow the movie would still be playing. But at 3 hours and 58 minutes, This is the kind of sweeping historical costume drama that used to be Hollywood's bread and butter. I mean, this was, once again, this was the marvel of the 1930s in a lot of ways. David O. Selznick's grandest, not his best, but his grandest, most ambitious achievement. And I finally sat down and watched it in summer of 1998 during a re-release in Los Angeles. And because I do like Hollywood's golden age, the year 1939 it's one of those monster years like 1982 or 1971 where you just had a flood of amazing movies. And for me, movies like Stagecoach or The Roaring Twenties, Ninotchka, or Only Angels Have Wings, that is my taste. Gone with the Wind is not to my taste, but it has a few scenes where I get why it was so stirring and so romantic to people, but I like my Southern movies to be a little rougher. Give me something like Deliverance. In any event, the movie only has a lifetime gross of $200 million because obviously in 1939, tickets were a little bit cheaper. But when you adjust for inflation, we come to a grand total of roughly $1,895 million, making it easily the most popular movie ever released in the United States. That is, at least unless Star Wars can find a way to sell 24 million more tickets in the years to come, which I think is doable, but I think the only way I would see Star Wars again in the theater would be if they released the 1977 cut fully restored. I don't want the special edition. I don't want any extra bells and whistles. Just give me the original experience, but fully restored in its pristine form. And I would add a few more ticket sales to Star Wars' grand tally. In any event, I hope you enjoyed this change of pace for the channel. I want to start dabbling more with topics that are not just reviews of movies. I feel like, I don't know, it's time for this channel to evolve and change and grow a bit. I just hit 28,000 subscribers, and I'm like, you know what? Just offering reviews, it's fine, but it's totally subjective. Dealing with some numbers, I feel like it's fun to talk about. So I hope you enjoyed this change of pace. If so, give me a shout on Twitter at Geeking Out, and please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. And if you're looking to support this channel, or if you're looking to support my podcast, Wrong Reel, please consider going to manscaped.com and using the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps. It'll get you 20% off any and all sales, along with free shipping and handling. And it's a great way to keep your jumbly tumblers looking fresh and clean during the summer beach and pool season, and I know everybody can get down with that at any rate. So I think I've run out of things to say. I'm going to wrap this sucker up. Can't thank anyone for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.